From the Times and the Sunday Times, this is The Story. I'm Manveen Rana. Over the last few days, markets all over the world have been heading in one direction: down.
Breaking news this morning, we are witnessing the rapid destruction of the market. Stock futures are plunging this morning once again, as the turmoil from President Trump's trade war is rocking markets here in the United States and around the world.
The Dow lost more than 2,000 points Friday. It was only the fourth time in history that's happened.
Today, the markets are already down across Europe, across Asia, and a lot of anxiety about what happens next.
American and international markets have tanked.
I mean, none of it makes any sense. Billions and trillions of dollars are being wiped out of the market on a day-to-day basis. So it was just blood in the streets.
Carnage, panic, bloodbath doesn't even begin to cut it. And you look at the decline worst since 2008. We're seeing the reeling from this ramped up tariff war.
JP Morgan now predicts a 60% chance of a global recession this year. Their report is titled, quote, "There will be blood."
There will be blood. With a bloodbath already playing out in the markets, which could soon spread to the economy, even Trump supporters are having second thoughts.
Billionaire hedge fund manager and Donald Trump supporter Bill Ackman is now leading Wall Street's backlash to the tariffs, calling Trump's tariff plan a, quote, self-induced economic nuclear winter, also saying this is not what we voted for.
Are we facing an economic nuclear winter? And is the tariff turmoil tearing the Trump administration apart? The story today: could Trump's tariffs split the Republicans?
I'm Jerry Baker. I'm editor-at-large at the Wall Street Journal. Despite my accent, I am American. I've lived here for 30 years, but originally British. I write a column for the Wall Street Journal and a column for the Times.
Jerry, the world woke up on Monday morning to the markets plummeting in Asia, then Europe, now America. The FT is saying that it could be worse than the Great Depression. How bad is this in context?
Well, we don't know. I mean, I have seen one of the first stories I ever worked on as a journalist was the 1987 stock market crash, when stock prices in the United States fell by 22% in a day. Now, we've seen two-day decline of about 10% last Thursday, Friday. Stocks are coming down again on Monday. So we're heading into that sort of territory. It should be said, by the way, that stock market recovered very quickly from that 87 crash, and the economy was hardly affected. So one of the very unusual things about the situation we're in right now is this crash, this dramatic re-evaluation of the state of the economy and of companies has been caused by one man's decision, literally one man's decision. Normally, we've had these big financial downturns several times in the past. 87 I talked about. That was caused by a number of things, large number of indebted companies, particularly in the US, and fears about the deficit. 2008, we all remember, of course, which was caused by the massive collapse of the mortgage market in the United States. We had a big fall in stock markets and in the economy when COVID happened, because the world was literally shutting down, companies were shutting down. All of those things. This has been caused literally by one man. And again, whether you agree with it or not, there's no question that the cause of this is Donald Trump's decision to do what he did last week. Before we can really predict what's going to happen, we have to say it's not impossible that he could undo those. I think it's unlikely as it stands, but given the kind of damage we're seeing, wouldn't completely put it past him to say at some point in the next day or two, I've done all these negotiations with all these other countries around the world, and I'm now in a position to, reduce the tariffs or whatever. So there's just this huge level of uncertainty, which means that people don't want to invest either in stocks or in real factories and businesses and everything else. And that itself can have a much larger effect on the economy than just the impact of the tariffs themselves. So it's the combination of these extraordinarily high taxes that Trump is imposing and the additional uncertainty that the economy faces as a result that is making people worry about a significant downturn. I think another Great Depression is highly unlikely, but the odds of a recession, certainly, the odds of that are now quite high.
And in terms of the uncertainty and Donald Trump's personal reaction to this, in a way, the last time he was in power, the markets could sort of factor that in. They called it the Trump put, where he seemed to watch the market so closely that if any of his policies led to an adverse reaction, he'd kind of change his mind, he'd row back. That doesn't seem to be happening now. He's been out over the weekend saying this is just the medicine, he's going to ride it out.
I don't want anything to go down, but sometimes you have to take medicine to fix something. And we have such a horrible, we have been treated so badly by other countries because we had stupid leadership that allowed this to happen.
It's almost as if the Trump administration was expecting the markets to plummet and don't seem to mind. They've sort of factored that in.
Back then, Trump's instincts on everything, but particularly on economics, were to some extent reined in or at least modulated by people who had their own kind of independent standing almost within the Republican Party, within the government. This time around, these are complete Trump loyalists who seem to have absolutely no desire whatsoever or no ability to stand up to Trump and say, this doesn't make any sense. So we have that phenomenon. By the way, it is true that they did actually, in advance of these tariffs, they were saying, look, markets go up, markets go down. Just a month ago, Donald Trump kind of quite famously said, I'm going to do these economic policies. And he used the famous phrase, which may come back to haunt him, there will be some disturbance.
Tariffs are not just about protecting American jobs. They're about protecting the soul of our country. Tariffs are about making America rich again and making America great again, and it's happening, and it will happen rather quickly. There'll be a little disturbance, but we're okay with that.
So, yeah, there does seem to be a higher tolerance, but there are other avenues for this. One is Republicans in Congress. If we are going to have a recession, which does look increasingly likely, which starts at the end of this year, later this year and goes through into next year, there are important midterm elections next year when the House of Representatives is re-elected and a third of the Senate. If Republicans think they're going to lose their seats because they're going to be in a deep recession, then there's a chance that they will push back here. So none of this is good for anybody sort of trying to make plans.
Yeah. Just give us a sense, firstly, of what is the coverage like out there of the markets plummeting? Because initially, I suppose people would sort of think, well, it doesn't affect me, I don't invest, but obviously it does. When companies are having part of their value wiped off, it will affect ordinary Americans. Just talk us through how it's going down.
It does affect ordinary Americans. I mean, one of the many, many remarkable things that are going on in this country is this inversion that we have had between our two political parties on so many things now, in terms of who supports them, in terms of their policies. The Democrats used to be for working people, and now the Republicans are for working people. And one of the remarkable things we've heard over the last few days is a Republican Treasury Secretary, himself a billionaire, Scott Bessent, saying,
Americans who have put away for years in their savings accounts, I think they don't look at the day-to-day fluctuations of what's happening. And, in fact, most Americans don't have everything in the market.
Kind of implying that, well, the wealthy are fine. 10% of the country own half the stocks, and the next 40% of the country own the rest of the stocks. Half the country, 50% of the country, doesn't own any stocks at all and are barely struggling to get by, and they're the people we're concerned about. It is true that about half the country doesn't actually have direct or indirect ownership of stocks. Still, half the country that does is still a large number. Pensions are directly tied to the stock market. Even for the 50% of the country that doesn't own stocks, first of all, they're all going to be hit by higher import prices, and all those people buy, whether it's avocados from Mexico or sneakers from Vietnam or cars from Germany or whatever. So they're all going to be hit by those. But if there's a downturn in the economy of this scale, everybody's going to suffer. I mean, wages are going to be hit. A lot of unemployment is going to go up. So there is some attention being paid to that. Right now we have, as you know, Manveen, very well, we have highly partisan politics in this country.
Yeah.
So there is still a significant part of the Republican supporting half of the country, and a lot of the Republican supporting media that says, no big deal, it's fine. Most people don't own stocks. We've got to take a little bit of pain. President Trump's right. We've got to fix this big problem that America's had for a long, long time. We've got to eliminate these trade deficits. And if it isn't hurting, it isn't working, as it were. No pain, no gain. So there's still an element of that. But I think there is also, I think we're starting to see, a significant number of people who aren't as partisan, or even some who are partisan Republicans, who are starting to worry. They're seeing what's happened to their pensions and their stocks. They're concerned about what's going to happen to the economy. They're seeing what their business leaders are saying about what may happen to the economy in the next few months. And I think the political ramifications will be, if things don't change, will be very significant.
And, talking about the division of the costs effectively to the different parts of the population, as you said, Scott Besant is sort of trying to define 50% of the public who own shares and the other 50% who don't. The Wall Street Journal has written about one of the places where the tariffs are going to hit the hardest actually being Michigan, the Rust Belt, which you'd imagine wouldn't really be part of the plan if the Trump administration is trying to reach out to people who are very much part of that bottom 50%.
So again, this is where the kind of, long-term gain, short-term pain argument comes in. One of the arguments the administration is making, and there are flaws in it, it's not completely wrong, is that US manufacturing has been hollowed out by trade over the last 30, 40 years. And there's no question about that. US places like the Rust Belt, places like Michigan, the Midwest, industrial Midwest, you only have to go and visit those places to see. And this is where, by the way, it's not just an economic phenomenon. This is where you see these communities that have been devastated by the loss of jobs, by the loss of people, by the loss of income. And they, this is where some of the worst problems with drug addiction and various social pathologies take place. So if those people can be persuaded that this will, and there is a very easy way of sort of making the case, which is to say, we're no longer going to be importing cars from Canada or Mexico or steel from Korea or China. We're going to be doing those things here again, and Michigan obviously is the center of the car industry. So if they can make that case, then I think people are persuaded. The problem, exactly though, as you say, is that at least in the short term, and by the short term, we could be talking years here, those communities are going to be hard hit, because if you work in the car industry in Michigan, steel prices are going to go up enormously. Trump's put up tariffs on steel in particular. Steel prices are going to go up. The other major industries in those areas depend significantly on imported materials. If there's retaliation, we've already seen it from China, we're expecting it from other countries, the goods that parts of the country produce and export are going to be hit hard. They're not going to be able to sell their goods into Europe or China, less in China, but to other countries too. So people might be persuaded that this policy will restructure the US economy in the longer term so that kind of good, high wage paying manufacturing jobs will come back to places like the Midwest. Again, that's highly questionable. Again, this is a very, very widespread economic impact, and it's going to have both serious economic consequences and political consequences.
And even if you take the longer term view, the view where this works out and you can start getting manufacturing jobs in some of those Rust Belt states again, it would mean that people would just have to get used to, buying less and buying things for more money than they've had to for decades. The cheap sneakers you buy are suddenly always going to be much more expensive. Buying an iPhone will cost a hell of a lot more.
Yeah, and one of the problems with the sort of long-term gain, short-term pain argument is it's not really clear what those, let's take sneakers as a very good example, right? Nike produces a significant proportion of its sneakers in Vietnam, where labor costs are maybe a couple of dollars an hour. So if we stop importing those sneakers from Vietnam, and, the argument is we're going to bring industrial production back to the US, does anybody really think that American companies are going to be able to produce sneakers for $1, $2, $3 an hour in the United States? No, they're not. Average wages in the minimum wage in the United States in most states is $15, $20 an hour. Average wages are $50, $60 an hour. And then there's the question, a lot of people have sort of been having some sort of gallows humor fun with this. Are we really, is this what the future of the US economy looks like? We're going to be producing sneakers and parts for iPhones and parts for computer game consoles and things like that. Is that what we really want? I thought we were supposed to be investing heavily in AI and robotics and things like that. So I think, there's a fundamental implausibility about a lot of the arguments. While again, there are some things to what Trump is saying about the hollowing out of US manufacturing, there's a big elision, Manveen, between making that argument and saying, US manufacturing has been hit pretty hard over the last 30 years or so because of cheap competition from overseas, and somehow saying, and we're going to impose these tariffs, and in a couple of years, we're going to make everything here, and everybody's going to have higher incomes and cheap goods and everything else. You can't. We're either, if we're going to produce sneakers here, and then we're going to pay people $15, $20 an hour to produce sneakers, then we're going to be paying $500 for a pair of sneakers rather than $150. So, there's a lot wrong with this economic theory.
So that's why it's going to have a huge impact on the poorer parts of society. The other part of, I suppose, Trump's base almost has been, if you looked at his inauguration, you'd sort of think it was an annual general meeting of billionaires. It certainly seems to be hitting them quite hard too. We've seen billions wiped off their companies. One person who's made his feelings particularly clear this weekend is Bill Ackman. For those here who don't know him, just give us a sense of who he is, how big a part he plays, I suppose, in the Trump universe, and what he's saying.
Well, so he's not he's not like Elon Musk, with a role in the Trump administration. He's not even been like some of those tech leaders that you saw at the inauguration, as you mentioned, people like Jeff Bezos of Amazon or Tim Cook of Apple. He's an influential Wall Street figure. He runs a hedge fund, which he's done for a long time, made a lot of money for himself and for his investors, done extremely well. And I think it was something of a surprise. I mean, he wasn't particularly known to be political before a couple of years ago. But like a lot of people, a lot of business leaders in the last couple of years, I think they were very turned off by what Joe Biden did. Understandably, Joe Biden believed in a sort of highly regulated economy. The Democrats in a highly regulated economy. They thought that was very damaging for the long term for the US. They embraced Donald Trump because they thought Donald Trump was going to cut taxes, deregulate, be good overall for the US, as he had been in the first 3 years of his administration 4 years ago. And Ackman was one of those Wall Street figures who came out very publicly through public statements and postings on X and elsewhere saying how much he supported Donald Trump.
Trump is the only candidate that's talked about accelerating the growth of the country. And the only way we're going to dig ourselves out of $36 trillion worth of liabilities is through growth.
He's a good example, I think, of one of the problems that a lot of the business leaders, a trap that they fell into. I think a lot of them thought Donald Trump is going to come in, he's going to cut taxes, he's going to deregulate, exactly as he said. I know he said he's going to do this crazy stuff with tariffs, but he's not really going to do it. It's all a threat. It's all a negotiating tactic. Even if he wants it, he'll be dissuaded by smart people, or the market's going to fall and he'll immediately back off. Well, 2 months in, we know better that Trump doesn't seem to want to back off. He is serious about these tariffs. So Ackman is one of those people who is saying, whoa, I kind of didn't vote for this.
Just listen to one of Donald Trump's most prominent Wall Street backers, a hedge fund manager called Bill Ackman, said overnight that Trump's tariffs could lead the world into what he called economic nuclear winter. He called for a 90-day pause on those taxes.
Frankly, he did, because let's be fair to Donald Trump, he's doing exactly what he said he would do. So, yeah, he's come out against it. I think in some ways, Manveen, perhaps more interesting, even than someone like Bill Ackman and other Wall Street people, is what we might call the relative silence of Elon Musk this weekend. I mean, Elon Musk, anybody who follows him on X, there was a time when at the peak of his Doge activities, he was tweeting every minute or posting every minute. He came out, he did post one thing at the weekend, which is a little video of him saying,
I'm hopeful, for example, with the tariffs, that at the end of the day, I hope it is agreed that both Europe and the United States should move, ideally, in my view, to a zero tariff situation, effectively creating a free trade zone between Europe and North America.
Which is extraordinary, really. And then he went even further, because he then took a shot at Donald Trump's, one of Donald Trump's top economic advisors, Peter Navarro, using an expletive, saying Peter Navarro didn't know anything because he hadn't built anything. So that, to me, is quite interesting. Again, another indication of a split between Trump and Musk. But look, whether it's Ackman or Musk or any of these people, there is no one, Manveen, there is no one in business who thinks that what's happened in the last week is a positive for the US economy or for US business. And they are coming out with varying degrees of vociferousness and making their views plain that this is hurting.
Musk has gone a bit further. He's now tweeted a clip of Milton Friedman explaining how a pencil can't be made in one country.
Yeah, how the world economy works through free trade. Yeah,
and
exactly.
it sort of feels like for one part of the Trump administration, who are free marketeers like Musk, who have a view of economics, which I suppose most of the market agrees with, based on that Milton Friedman idea of, you need comparative advantage in different countries you need to be able to exploit that, versus this sort of slightly 19th century version that some of his advisors are putting forward of trying to reintroduce trade tariffs and trying to make America sort of cut off an awful lot of, reverse globalization almost. I mean, just talk us through that. Is this sort of like a serious split at the heart of the administration?
I think the problem, actually, Manveen, is it's worse than that. I do think that people like Scott Bessent, the Treasury Secretary, Howard Lutnick, the Commerce Secretary, people like Kevin Hassett, President's White House economic advisor, Steve Mirren, who has been quite an influential figure and has got these big ideas about reshaping the entire world financial system. I think they're to varying degrees on board with what Trump wants to do, with high levels of skepticism, but they broadly support the idea that, we want to find ways to bring manufacturing back to the United States and raise real wages for people who've been hit very hard by globalization. I think those people have sort of more or less signed on. The real problem with what Trump is doing is worse than that. Again, this was why things in the last week have turned so ugly. Because you could have made a case, and in fact, they were going out and making a case, these people a week ago, saying what the United States needs is reciprocal tariffs. We've been treated unfairly. Other countries have tariffs against us, or if they're not tariffs, they have other non-tariff barriers against our goods, regulations, and kind of incredibly detailed levels of specificity for certain products, and they make it hard for us to do business and to sell our products there. And again, there is something to that. It's been true in Japan for a long time, certainly true in China, even true in some respects with some of the things that the United States sells to the EU. So the argument a week ago was, we're going to level the playing field. That was an argument that not a lot of people were happy about that, but they could certainly go along with it. It's very clear from what they came out with last week, from what Trump came out with his famous list, and how we discovered that the list was calculated, was it's not about reciprocity. It's not about balancing trade practices between the United States and its major trading partners. It is literally, and Trump kind of said this on his little appearance on Air Force One last night, he said it again very explicitly, Trump is fixated on the trade deficit and in goods only. And what he says then is the United States must have a trade surplus with every single country in the world. Now that literally, no matter how you try to spin it, Manveen, is utter economic illiteracy. It makes no sense. First of all, it's mathematically impossible. But secondly, that's not the way the world works. The United States imports things from certain countries that make certain things. The perfect example is the United States doesn't really produce any of its own coffee, a little bit in Hawaii maybe. So Americans love coffee. They drink tons of it. Brazil makes most of the coffee. America has a huge trade deficit in agricultural products with Brazil because Americans like coffee. Then America, is very, very good at making phones. So ultimately selling phones, if you like. So it sells phones to countries like the UK, with whom it has a trade surplus. It's not only just mathematically obvious, but it's actually economic logic that that countries will have a trade deficit with some countries, that countries and a trade surplus with other countries. What Donald Trump is trying to do, supposedly, is to magic into existence a world in which the United States has a trade surplus in goods with every single country on the planet. And if it doesn't do that, it's going to impose these tariffs. That is just impossible to defend, because his aim is supposedly to eliminate the US trade deficit with every single country that it has a trade deficit with. It's just not going to happen.
And there's no negotiating that will get around that. You're right. With Brazil, either Americans will just have to stop drinking coffee, or there's no possibility that Brazilians are suddenly going to be able to buy mass American goods. And it's the same with Botswana and diamonds. America isn't going to suddenly find its own diamonds,
Correct.
But it's the same problem. Given that, how long do you think Donald Trump can hold his nerve on this? Because he must start to see that this isn't viable in the future. And how long do you think American people will put up with it?
We'll see how much more damage there is to the financial markets, right? Again, we're seeing more disruption today. There was some indication a little bit earlier that things might be sort of maybe bottoming out. The Dow futures was down a lot and then came back a bit. It's the way markets work. Ultimately, the direct impact of these tariffs on the US economy is bad, but it's not. Stock markets are down 10, 15%. It shouldn't, other things being equal, knock down the US economy or the stream of profits for US companies by 10 to 15%. It's probably not going to do that. So at some point, people are going to say, well, actually, a company like Apple or Nvidia is down 30, 40% or whatever from where it was a couple of months ago. It's actually, this is a great company with great prospects and things are going to bottom out. So look, I think there's a chance that maybe the markets kind of calm down. I think there's still a chance, despite what I just said about Trump's ultimate goal here being to eliminate deficits. I think there's still a chance that he will be prevailed upon by his economic advisors and especially with the prospect of some pressure from Congress to say, look, okay, I want, deals. I'm in it for deals. We can do some deals. There was some talk, over the weekend, we heard Kevin Hassett, the White House advisor, boasting that the United States had been approached by 50 countries who wanted to make a deal. Well, there's a chance that Trump will say, I've had so much winning, everybody's agreed to meet with me that we can't go on like this, and they've all agreed to reduce their tariffs. And so, what I'm going to do, I've had so much success, I'm going to impose a 10% tariff on everybody. 3 months ago, the markets would have said, oh my God, a 10% tariff. They would say, thank God, it's Liberation Day. That really would be Liberation Day. So I think that's still the likeliest outcome. But who knows? He may just decide that, that is really his goal, to do the impossible thing. And then we are into a really serious downturn if it continues.
And if he doesn't change his mind, if we are into a serious downturn, how bad do you think it could get? I mean, some people are talking about stagflation in America.
While we can argue about the actual whether tariffs increase inflation or just increase prices, there's no doubt, and the Federal Reserve has already said this, that as well as suppressing output and demand, prices will rise. I mean, it's obvious. You're going to pay an extra, 25% for your sneakers or your iPhone, then prices are going to go up. And if consumers then say, well, price is going to go up 25%, I need another 25% pay increase from my employer. And then the employer has, not going to give 25%, might go up. So you could see the risk of a wage price spiral. So that is what's so problematic about this policy in particular, is it not only is it going to depress output and demand, it will at the same time raise prices. And that makes the normal response, the normal way in which policymakers respond to a recession, which is the central bank cuts interest rates, and if the fiscal authorities have got room, they expand the economy. It makes that trickier, because that will, at the same time as increasing demand, that will further increase prices. We're back here, Manveen, to where we were in the 1970s, and I'm someone around today who's old enough to remember it. And we had this period where we had very low growth, very high unemployment, but very, very high price rises. And we could be talking about a sustained period of unemployment significantly higher than it is today, at about 4%, and inflation significantly higher than it is today, at about 3%. So it's just another reason why this policy is so problematic for the economy.
It really is a gloomy outlook. Just finally, in the past, it was always said that if America sneezes, the rest of the world catches a cold. I mean, would this lead to a global downturn? Or is there a world where other countries end up sort of moving towards freer trade with each other and just slightly cutting America out?
Forgive me for sort of the rather unpleasant metaphor, but this is not a case of America sneezing, the rest of the world catching cold. This is the case of America kind of smearing its sputum, its virally infected sputum on a handkerchief all over its neighbours, because it's a deliberate choice, a deliberate action. The US is the largest economy in the world. It's 20% of global output. Its financial markets are hugely important. It's about 60% of global financial assets. The US can't be cut off. It would be nice to think, perhaps, if you live in Europe, that you could sort of somehow, let's just forget about the US. You can't. It's financially vast. It's economically very important. And the Europeans just don't have a lot of things that Americans can produce very efficiently and very well, like, electronic goods or financial services or business services and things like that. So it's impossible for the world to escape what's happening now through anything it may try to do.
That was Gerard Baker, columnist at The Times and editor-at-large of the Wall Street Journal. You can read his weekly column at thetimes.com with a subscription. The producers today were Edward Drummond and Sam Chantarasak. The executive producers were Molly Guinness and Fiona Leach, and sound design and theme composition were by Mala Seto. If you can, do leave us a review wherever you get your podcasts. Thanks for listening. See you tomorrow.